3 weeks after my wedding, the silence of my new life was broken by a sudden, wordless encounter at the boundary of my property. My neighbor, a woman whose face was etched with the same quiet exhaustion I felt, walked toward my fence with a strange, purposeful stride. She did not offer a greeting or a smile. Instead, she scanned the horizon, looking left and then right, ensuring the gravel road and the distant barns were empty of witnesses. With a quick, trembling motion, she pressed a small glass jar into my palms. It was plain, unlabeled, and filled with a mysterious golden substance that caught the afternoon light. Before I could find the breath to ask a single question, she turned on her heel and retreated, disappearing as if she had never been there at all. I stood alone in the dirt, clutching that cold glass, my mind spinning with confusion. I was a bride of 21 days, already hollowed out by a secret agony, unaware that this simple jar held the key to my liberation. By that 21st day of marriage, the girl I had been before the wedding felt like a distant, fading ghost. For 3 agonizing weeks, I had spent every night lying in the heavy darkness of our room, biting the inside of my cheek with such desperate intensity that the metallic tang of blood became a familiar companion. I was terrified that a single gasp or a stray tear would betray my weakness. Each morning, I forced myself out of bed before the first light of dawn broke over the Pennsylvania fields. I donned my plain dress, lit the black iron stove, and moved through the rhythmic chores of feeding the animals and tending the house. I performed these duties while trapped in a physical pain I had no name for and no language to explain. I truly believed that this hollowed-out version of myself was what a wife was meant to be. I told myself that this was my burden, my duty, and the sacred price of my obedience. I was prepared to endure it forever.
The architecture of my suffering was supported by 3 unyielding pillars of our faith, none of which considered a woman's well-being. The first was submission. A wife's physical experience was never framed as something that mattered, her comfort treated as a secondary thought at best. The second pillar was the belief in suffering as a virtue. In my community, physical hardship was not a problem to be solved, but a cross to be carried. Endurance was equated with faithfulness, and seeking comfort was branded as hochmut, the dangerous sin of pride. The third pillar was a silence so thick it was mistaken for modesty. Discussing the body, especially the intimate realities of marriage, was strictly forbidden. To prepare a bride practically would have meant admitting out loud that the wedding night involved something physical, and that admission alone was seen as a step toward impropriety. Because of these 3 pillars, every bride I knew, including myself, walked into her new life with 0 information, 0 preparation, and a total lack of understanding of what her own body might actually need. I married Daniel in late October on a Tuesday, the traditional day for Amish weddings after the final harvest is gathered. The ceremony was a marathon of endurance, held in my parents' home, where we sat on hard wooden benches for nearly 4 hours. Between the long German sermons, the slow singing from the Ausbund, and the final declaration before the bishop, my body was already spent. By the time the meal for hundreds of guests was over, and Daniel and I were finally alone, I had been awake since 4 in the morning. My feet throbbed, my neck ached, and underneath my exhaustion, I was paralyzed by a fear I couldn't articulate. It wasn't the fear of a known danger, but the terrifying weight of knowing something life-altering was coming, while having absolutely no idea what it would be. Daniel, despite being 23 and capable of running a massive farm, was nearly as uninformed as I was. In our community, the silence didn't just target women, it left everyone standing in the dark. The truth in our community never moved in a straight line. It traveled sideways, through whispers and secrets disguised as something else. I often thought of my friend Sarah, who was married at 19, 2 years before I was. She had suffered in total silence for 2 full years, believing that her pain was simply the natural price of being a submissive wife. She lay in the dark night after night, telling herself that her endurance was a form of obedience to God, never knowing that any other reality was possible for her. One day, at a quiet quilting bee, an older woman she barely knew began talking about cooking. She mentioned olive oil, then looked at Sarah for just a moment too long. "Oil is good for many things," the woman whispered without looking up from her stitching. Sarah drove home that day with her hands shaking on the reins. When she realized the solution had been in her kitchen cupboard the entire time, she wept for an hour, not for the pain, but for the years lost to a silence that didn't have to be. Eventually, the silence between Daniel and me reached a breaking point. We were sitting at the kitchen table long after supper, the single lamp casting long, flickering shadows against the wooden walls. I had rehearsed my confession for days, yet when the moment came, the words still felt heavy and foreign. I finally spoke about the pain, the fear, and the hidden jar from my neighbor. Daniel looked at me, his face a mixture of confusion and sudden realization. "Why didn't you tell me?" he asked softly. I looked back at him and whispered the only truth I knew. "Because I didn't know I was allowed to." We sat in that kitchen for a long time, the only sounds being the steady ticking of the clock and the horses shifting in the barn outside. That 30-minute conversation was the most honest moment of our entire marriage, and it only happened because a stranger had dared to press a jar into my hand. It was the first time we realized our community silence had failed us both. Years later, an English doctor looked at me and said 3 words that shattered my heart. That was completely preventable. Those words brought a mixture of grief and a cold, enormous rage. I realized then that control doesn't always look like a locked door. Sometimes it looks like information that was never given. My therapist taught me that no theology requires a woman to suffer unnecessarily, and no scripture consecrates her pain as holy. I am Rebecca, and I left that world of shadows behind to finally say the things my community would never allow me to say out loud. The olive oil was always in the kitchen, but the tragedy is that the solution had to come from a neighbor in secret at social risk, rather than from a mother, a church, or a community. If you grew up in a world where your silence was called obedience, I see you. Your comfort matters, your body matters, and your experience matters. Choose your freedoms wisely. They might just save your life.